welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many people here for our pre-concert talk before Benjamin Alard plays the whole Well-Tempered Clavier, at least the first book, where we were going to save the second as an encore, that's what is the problem with my title here, is that it's referring to both books. My name is David Plylar, and I'm a music specialist in the music division of the Library of Congress. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking about the Well-Tempered Clavier. And I thought I'd try to tell you a few different things about it that you might not know, or you may know and we'll hear again. The significance of having this work performed in its entirety right now is that this is the 300th anniversary of its composition, at least when it was first put down in its initial form. It went through subsequent revisions that were memorialized in interesting ways over the years. There's an interesting history of publication and manuscript conveyance of this work that I'm not going to get into deeply right now, except to say that the Bach children copied it, Anna Magdalena copied it, others copied it so that it was preserved, and there's actually a wonderful autographed manuscript in Bach's hand of the work held at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. And so that's kind of this wonderful thing, because it wasn't really published until 1801, so some 50-odd years after Bach's death. So we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And in particular, that Well-Tempered Clavier title refers to the 24 preludes and fugues that make up the first book. Bach did not call it Book 1 at that time because he didn't know. Presumably he didn't know that there was going to be a Book 2 or a Part 2. That would come in 1740, quite a bit later, and that's when, so he kept kind of doing these little revisions over the years, with a major set done by 1732, and even more done even into the 40s once the second book was complete. So instead of what's so great about the 48, I decided to go with what you've not heard before about the 24. Oh, okay, that one did not go over well. And now I know the answer to this question, so I'll just keep going on here. Speaking of the temperaments, we do need to talk about the two most important words in the title of this work. Das Wohltemperierte Klavier. Das, no. Wohltemperierte. So this is referring to well-tempered. What does that mean? This is, again, something that it turns into kind of a landmine discussion, and it's a difficult discussion, and one that lots of different experts have different opinions about. But ultimately, I think it's safe for me to say that it's seeking a way to play in all the different keys that are available at a keyboard. And this is not possible with perfect types of tuning. So like mean tone tuning and things like that, you have imperfections in different keys. And so you would have, you'd be able to play, 3, 4 flats, something like that, but to go beyond that was not wise because of the wolf tones would get you and stuff. So the idea was to try to kind of advance this thing. This was something that was in the air, but the goal was to have this, what I'm calling versatility through imperfection of the tuning. The second word that's important is clavier. And so the question is, what is the instrument that we're referring to? And I think it's fairly accepted that it's just meaning keyboard in this case, so that it can refer to clavichord, harpsichord, organ that could be played on. In fact, there's one in particular that seems like it should be played on organ because of the way it's written, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the idea is that it's not just for harpsichord, it's not just for clavichord or any or forte piano, which was coming about here. So because of that, of course, pianists took it upon themselves in the 19th century to turn them into piano pieces. And so you have these editions by Carl Czerny, Ferruccio Busoni, other people like that have all kinds of different dynamic markings and pedal markings and ways that you're supposed to manage the piano with this work. But that might have been going a bit far, but at the same time, it's hard to, one has to wonder what Bach would have thought of this new instrument and what it could have, the modern piano, and what it had to offer, and probably would have been excited about it. But I'm speculating, and so I don't know. So in this case, what we're going to hear tonight is on a harpsichord. And so that's going to be an exciting thing. When we look at the title page of this work, it's quite something. It looks to me like it's either a hot air balloon or a slightly misshapen heart or something like that. I'm not sure what it is, but what it says there is the well-tempered clavier. This is the title. The well-tempered clavier, or preludes and fugues in every key, including those with the major third and those with the minor third, but not those without them, presumably, I guess. For the use and benefit of inquisitive young musicians and for the special diversion of those already well-versed in the study. Set down and composed by Johann Sebastian Bach, chapel master and director of chamber music to the Prince of Anhalt-Köthen in the year 1722. So he's being very clear. This is a very fair copy. It's a beautiful, I'll have images from the manuscript for you to see. But he's being very clear about what it is, and there's a kind of a didactic sort of bent here. It's, of course, much more than that, but there's a reason for that, I believe, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Just to say a couple quick words about some origins of where this sort of prelude and fugue deal is coming from. It's been in the air for a long time, and people have been writing preludes and fugues for a number of years at that point. And if anybody was here for yesterday's recital, there was a work by Buxtehude on it that was one of the preludes. And these preludiums, as they're often called, for the most part, were inclusive of fugues or fugal type of writing. So you'd have within the prelude itself would be the prelude and fugue together. So it was kind of a natural development, I guess, to split them apart, though not necessarily groundbreaking, because oftentimes it's just you split it apart by a pause, just as you would in the actual prelude that you're doing. So maybe that wasn't the biggest development that happened here, but there was another composer and organist named Johann Caspar Ferdinand Fischer, the JC, I can't remember the JCF parts. And he wrote a work for organ called Ariadne Musica. And this particular work was in 19 different keys. And so it was a very, he worked with an organist or an organ to get it tuned to be able to handle this in about 1702, I think was the year. And so this was it was something that people were trying and experimenting, but of course, the problem is with keyboard instruments in particular is that they're fixed. You can't tune them on the fly, so you have to find a way to deal with getting to different keys. In the one thing I wanted to say about those two elements of where these things are coming from, with the Buxtehude in particular, there's one prelude in the Well-tempered Clavier, Book 1, that is the E-flat major, excuse me, the E-flat major prelude that has this sort of Buxtehude-ish prelude quality to it, and that it has fugal components in that prelude. So it's a complicated one, so you'll want to keep an ear out for that. And then the A minor fugue, some believe it's based on a Buxtehude construction, but the most interesting thing about it in some cases, in one view, would be that it's seems like it's written for an organ. So there's held tones in the bass, in particular, towards the end of the work, to a limited extent in the prelude as well, but especially in the fugue, where in order to maintain the sound, one would need to have an organ. Now, it was perfectly fine for harpsichordists or other keyboardists, clavichordists, to re-articulate notes as they needed to. So a tied note doesn't necessarily mean that it was always had to be tied. So there's different types of practice here that people would do, and we'll hear some of that tonight, because obviously we're not, bringing in an organ for that one, piece to take a look at. Another thing I'd like to say about the origins of this work is that there are a number of pieces from it, especially preludes, that are in the Clavier Buchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, who was Bach's oldest son through his first wife. And this was composed in 1720, at least it was. I don't know that the entire thing was completed at that point, but it was certainly well underway at that point. It has a number of preludes in it, kind of proto-preludes, pre-preludes, something like that. And those are some of the inventions and symphonias. You'll see these things there. And it's kind of an interesting thing because the reason it's so important is that it shows us, and I think that we need to be reminded at times, that people like Bach, people like Mozart, would often have first drafts of things, and it could have gone a completely different way, and that would have been just fine. Nobody would have realized it if it didn't, we didn't get that final version that we all happen to know. And so I think it's important to recognize that sort of humanity in the process. And so one that I wanted to start with, I'm going to play some examples for you that I just want to mention are courtesy, they're Benjamin Alard playing, and courtesy of Harmonia Mundi, his recent recording of these works. He's recording the entire keyboard output of Bach on both organ, or all three, organ, clavichord, and harpsichord. It's really something else and worth checking out. But we'll start with, this is the Preludium 1, it's called. And it's, 20 pages in to the Clavier Buchlein. And so we're going to listen to the whole thing. It's very short, but you'll recognize it, I think. So did that sound exactly like the piece that you know? No, it's not quite exactly the same. And one interesting thing about that recording is that was on a clavichord. So that's a different sound to what we'll hear next. But what you have is about midway through, it starts to go slightly a different direction harmonically, and maybe not exactly what we were expecting. And one interesting thing also is that Bach gets a little lazy towards the end of this page, and you can see that he's just basically like, okay, here's the chord, do the thing we've been doing. Little Wilhelm was only about 9 years old at the time, so he had to, he could fill this in for him. So it just kind of keeps going like that to the end. But what we hear I'm going to go ahead and play this very famous C major prelude in the Waltenberg Clavier version. So, you've probably all heard that piece before. It's what I start to hear as things change from that in the 2-year period is that there's a bit more of a sense of drama that comes into these pieces, and I'd like to make the argument that these are, in a sense, even though they were not necessarily intended to be performed as a cycle or anything like that, they do have very much this quality of being character pieces in the sense of there's a lot of thought that goes into the production of each piece and how they're laid out, not just in the preludes, but also in the fugues. Although I'm going to mostly focus on the preludes just because it's easier to show some of those examples. What I'm going to argue is that the textures that are involved, that are created by Bach, are meant to be this sort of character or mood building sort of thing. Not trying to define what those things are, just saying that it's very intentional the way that he'll dramatically change things harmonically or with what's happening with the accompaniment or just the flow of the piece in general in order to make some sort of larger musical argument beyond just here's a practice piece for you to try before you try one of the more difficult fugues, something. So a lot of the problem for the harpsichord is that, and just like a piano, if you don't hold down the pedal, is that once the note is struck or plucked, in this case, it's not going to sound beyond, it's going to lose its sound over time. So there's lots of different techniques that composers use to generate the sound in the first place and also to sustain that sound. And one of the most prolific ones would be basically dealing with broken chords and trying to, arpeggiations, harp-like accompaniments that can come out of chords that can provide a harmonic structure and from which both upper melodic line, inner voices, and bass lines can all emerge depending on how the composer deals with register. So I'm going to play another example of this, something similar to that prelude in C sharp, in C major that we just heard, another type of broken chord beginning in the C sharp major prelude, which will not be played in the order that. So I should mention that but in Bach's well-tempered clavier, they're going upward by chromatically, and so you start with C major, and you end with B minor. And so that's not the way that's going to be played tonight. And that's actually kind of exciting, I think, because it's a very different sort of tonal journey that you'll go on. And you can see that in the program. It's laid out specifically what's going to happen. But for our purposes here, we're talking about some broken chords. Here's the beginning of the prelude in C sharp major. Okay, I'm going to have to pop out here. Let's see. And I'm going to play another part of this example. Forgive the less attractive format here for a moment. And I'm just going to play from here. And I just want you to hear how that very basic idea that was just played becomes quite complicated. So you can hear that using the same these broken chords, it can create quite a complex texture to hear, even though it's still basically filling the same number of attacks per beat and so forth. So let's see if this goes back there. Okay. And next is another example of this sort of a textural affect that Bach creates from the very moment that it begins is the prelude in C minor. And so let's hear that, and we'll just hear the very beginning of it for now. get a sense, and I apologize for the abrupt changes. I don't quite have the sound controls I want from here, so I have to do what I can. So you can hear, though, that the hands are moving in a very specific way to create not only a harmonic sort of backdrop, but also it's a sound that is unique to that piece. When you hear that piece, you know that that's that C minor prelude, just like you would with any romantic work in terms of like recognizing this sort of as a character piece. And again, I'm not trying to equate these as being the same goals or anything like that, but just to say that each one of these pieces, in my view, has this sort of immediateness in its character. Then we have certain problems that come into play, and the problem is always, it's one of interpretation, one of how do you handle it as a performer, and this particularly has to do with ornamentation. Interestingly, in the Clavier Buchlein of 1720, Bach includes for Wilhelm Friedemann a table of ornaments that's kind of along the lines of what you would have seen 1689 or so, Danglebert and some others, of course, do these tables of ornaments that served as kind of guides to how one might approach this. But ornamentation was sometimes indicated, but it was also sometimes just expected that the performer would know what the practice was. And of course, at that time, they did. And so they didn't need to tell each other what to do. And there was, of course, improvisation played a much larger role with organists and classical musicians in general than it does today. Although there were certainly plenty of excellent improvisers around today in the classical world as well as others. So in any case, here's just an example of what is a problem that one has to solve. And here's how Alard solves it in this particular recording of the opening of the prelude in G minor. What you hear is that there's different ways that one can approach it, and you have to find what's also going to work for the particular instrument that you're playing on. In this case, I believe that he was playing on a 3-manual harpsichord that was from, I want to say late 18th century, or maybe it's earlier, but they, in the notes to his book about his CD for this recording, it mentions that this was an instrument that was around in Bach's time, and it was thought that maybe there were more of these types of large instruments actually available and around. They just didn't survive as long as today, as much as that one did. So that's another thing that musicians will take into account is whatever instrument they have to make it work for, they just have to make it work somehow. So that's the same thing that pianists have to do every time they go to a different hall and it's a different instrument that they encounter. They've got to do something to just make it work. And so that's another consideration there. Another case of the broken chords I want to bring up is the prelude in B-flat major. And this is one of I always think this is kind of a wild prelude in that it sets up something that's so memorable. It's very Beethoven-esque, actually, in some ways. Because Bach was copying Beethoven, obviously, but it's something that's. Let's just listen to a little bit of it, and then listen to also how it deviates from this. It sets up a pattern, and then it starts to deviate kind of quickly. We'll just listen to a bit of it. So I'll stop it there, but you could tell that, it's doing its arpeggiation thing, then it goes into this scalar cadenza-like passage, and then it's, chords that are coming through. So this is, to me, it's extremely dramatic. It's not, just a straightforward piece, not that like the C major prelude, which was consistent in terms of its type of topography across that whole prelude. So there's some interesting things that happen like this in a number of the preludes, including the next one that I'm going to show you, but I'm not going to show you that aspect of it. I'm going to show you instead another way that Bach develops character. And that's through interesting figuration that gets put in. So you'll have a pattern that might be a melodic pattern, or you might have an accompanimental pattern that serves this purpose. But the point is that there's something that you can hang your hat on to be able to kind of get a sense of the mood of the piece and whatnot. So in the prelude in D major, it's delightful. It's very clear what's happening at the very beginning. I'm going to actually escape out of this again so I can show you two spots, because I'll show you the beginning where it sets up this sort of clear thing that we should be listening to, and then his deviation from it. So you can listen for that as well. So here's the beginning of it. So you can hear it's a pattern that's set up, and it's delightful, and it's got an easy go-in bass. It's not something that's terribly challenging for the ear or anything. So you could tell that he's having a lot of fun with this sudden dramatic departure on a very light piece. And so I think that it shows him as a more jovial character maybe than he might often be thought of. I do think that these composers have a sense of humor that comes through in these types of details. The prelude in D minor is another one of those broken chord preludes that has you immediately recognize what it is, and composers, I think, grabbed onto this one as a very interesting way to manage things. And so in this one, I'll just play the beginning, so you can, actually, I'll play the beginning, and then I'll play one other interesting thing that happens with registral and textural changes that you can listen for. So that you can see it sets up a pattern, and it changes modalities, but it's a very kind of dark opening, and it's just wonderful. It's very simple, but it's because it has that sort of, it comes in on the offbeat within a beat that makes it kind of effective there. One place that this goes dramatically different is right around here. So the point of showing you some of these is so that you can hopefully have a couple of things that you can think about as we're listening to the performance tonight, and just notice the things that Bach does that then the harpsichordist does to vary the textures over time within the same work. Because I think that's one of those things where suddenly you have a dropping out of the bottom half of the keyboard. It creates this it's absolutely, kind of a stunning thing if you're listening to, if you're really in the moment and you're really kind of engaged with what's happening. It becomes very dramatic, even though it's not as loud as it might be with a different instrument. Bach was not above giving very consistent accompanimental figures as something to listen for. So that's always a fun thing too, just to kind of keep track of. Here's the beginning of the prelude in E minor that has one of these very memorable accompaniments that's very simple. So again, it sets a mood, and then he goes for it over time. But of course, he does not just the darker ones that I happen to be picking out here, but he also does these very interesting things that make me think at least of his other works and how he might be thinking of these orchestrally. And so one of these good examples is the prelude in F sharp major. I was going to start at the end, but I'll just start from the beginning because you can hear the same thing. There's some figuration that comes in that will sound probably familiar if you don't know this piece. It might sound like an oboe part from other famous works. So I'll play that. So you can hear that there's this, what's happening is simple but also complicated. You mostly have these two voices and they're playing in between each other. And it's kind of this wonderful thing, and then the upper line finally kind of catches up at the end. And it's again, one of the things that I think, in this case probably wasn't meant to be funny, but it was just one of those things that he does tend to do, this idea of catching up, and we'll look at that briefly in just a minute in a different piece. I'll play the beginning of the B flat minor prelude, just so you can hear another method of kind of setting in mood. So what's happening is that you'll have these pieces that get thicker and thicker and thicker, and so that's so there's certain ones like that use the thirds and the sixths, and those kind of come through in big ways, but they're not as often as you think. Actually, he's relatively economical with that type of accompaniment in the piece as a whole. In the prelude in B minor, we have a walk. And then we have things that are a bit more dramatic, and so we're going to quickly look at those since I'm looking at the time. The prelude C minor, let's skip out of here. It gets, we played that earlier, that had the opening that's very recognizable. Here's and then by the time we get about a minute in, we get this. And so you can see the drama kind of on the page. Like that's why I want to show you this, hearing it, but also seeing, the actual music that Bach wrote, because there's something about it that conveys that like a sense of urgency in this faster and faster music. And there are a couple of these preludes actually do have tempo markings in a few spots, but not many of them. I think only 3 or 4. The prelude in E-flat minor, I just want to play the opening because, again, I want you to remember this one was actually in the Clavier Buchlein. This was for a 9-year-old to kind of deal with. It's a very kind of heart-wrenching, heavy work, and one of the most remote keys that we have in the well-tempered clavier. So I just kind of marvel that some of these were written for a very young person to learn. But I guess that's the way you learn, is through tragic circumstances like that. The prelude in B-flat major has that stuff we've already looked at the end, where it goes out of that kind of regular type of accompaniment into rather ecstatic chords. And then I just want to, as we kind of near the end here, I do want to look a little bit at this type of textural differentiation that we start to hear in the Fugal writing. And this is a little bit harder to note because fugues have a particular way that they tend to go, and they tend to, but the thing about Bach's fugues in the well-tempered clavier is that they're there's a lot of variety that can be found there. And it's not all just technical things like looking for inversions and other types of things, although that's a lot of fun to do, and it's, some of us enjoy that kind of thing. But it's, there's also, I think there's a lot to say about how he handles the subjects and how they might inform how it works under the hands. So depending on the size of the intervals that are included in a subject, it may make it easier or harder to keep it under one hand when you're moving. And so there are certain things he does that are really smart, and then other ones that are still very smart but challenging to the performer because of the way he does it. But they tend to have a purpose when he does it a particular way. And so I wanted to give an example of a very straightforward fugue in terms of it being a very recognizable one, and every bar you hear basically the same idea coming back, and this idea of a theme, a subject, and little motives from that theme or subject you're going to hear a lot of. So I'm just going to play the beginning of it so you can hear about it. And I realize why the problem is. So let me get to the right spot. Here we go. So we hear that idea over and over again, so we know exactly what we're listening to, and it's not really a problem. But then we have other ones that where he's playing with us in different ways. And one of it is the Fugue in A major is one of the ones that makes me kind of laugh a bit, because it starts with a note and then it has like this hole in time. And you have to remember that, as the listener, presumably you're not looking at a score and following along. You're having to go with what you're hearing. And so there's this note and then silence, and then we start to hear things coming in, and then we're not really sure when the answer comes, which is the second statement of the subject at a different pitch point, because it comes in at the octave below the point where it is in the principal in in the first, the subject statement. So if you're hearing this for the first time, you wouldn't be able to follow it in the same way that you could that C minor fugue. So I'll just play the opening of that and see if you can see what I mean. But you have the benefit of seeing this music if you read music, you know, but may not. So that's still something to listen for. So you can see what I mean, that there's something kind of funny going on there. Another thing that he does that, and this, I'll get into a little bit of slightly more nerdy stuff here for just a moment, if you will let me, in that the fugue in C major has a great example of stretto that has like every voice coming in on top of each other. So stretto is typically, you'll have the subject and answer, and they kind of get squished together, so they come in different ways. And Bach was really good at doing this kind of a thing. He was also really good at invertible counterpoint, so that voice that's here and it has another voice here could then be heard on top of it, sometimes starting at different points. And this is one of the ways that it's not just kind of a neat thing to talk about. It has a very specific sonic effect. And so we'll hear just we'll hear the first example first, and then I'll play a little bit so you can hear the second example. So the top line here is right around here. The opening of the fugue. So then when we get to the stretto that I was talking about, around 217, here we go. So it's going to start shortly after this. I'm going to play just a few measures worth, but you'll hear how they just stack onto each other and create a completely unique texture. So you can see that it lets you go wherever he wants to go. It's a clever technique that's not easy to pull off, but he's able to do it in a way to really kind of launch into the stratosphere in that particular passage. And so it's a very, I think it's a very fascinating thing. Speaking of fascinating, I'm going to quickly go over the fugue in E minor. This one is unique in the well-tempered clavier because it's a two-voice fugue. But don't let that fool you because it's actually quite cleverly put together. And there's one thing in particular, just going back to the textural thing that I was talking about earlier as being kind of a overriding concern for Bach, that comes into play. And so I'm just going to play about 40 seconds of it. And you'll hear the beginning of the fugue and then up to a point where suddenly the two voices come together in unison at the octave. To me, this ends up being, just for one measure, well, they do it once later in the fugue as well, but it's something that kind of creates a very unique thing to hear in the context of just two voices. So this is the E minor fugue, beginning throughout 40 seconds. hear how that suddenly it just pops out. At least to me it does, as this sort of sonic, just kind of big moment that's clearly prepared and meant to happen in that particular way, in what seems like a simpler fugue setting, but since it only has 2 voices versus the 5 that you hear in some of the other ones. Most of them are in 3 or 4 voices. I'm just looking at, just about done here. I'll just keep going. At the fugue in G sharp minor, there's an element, I'm just going to play the beginning of it. There's a tag at the end of the subject that kind of comes through as a repeated note idea. And it's one of those things that you kind of would imagine, okay, if I don't know, Jimmy Bach or another Bach might have decided to write it, that would have reserved it towards the end of the piece and brought it out in that sort of a way. But Bach brings it out in measure 8. So I have it here. So let's listen to. So you can hear in those little spots there's a focus on that end part of the subject very early on, and it's something that has sort of a cadential feel to it. So for that reason, it's kind of an unusual thing to find at that early stage, but it just shows that, and then he doesn't do the same thing at the end. So it's a very imaginative fugue. Another type of, I just have a couple things left I'm going to show you, and then if there's time, I'll take a couple questions. But just want to show you a couple other kind of futuristic kind of things that Bach was doing in terms of creating interesting sounds with held tones and covering the gamut of the registers. So we'll start here at 30, and we should hear, hopefully we'll hear what I have written here. So often, you're hearing music that's like this, kind of in the middle. You think, then suddenly you have these like expansive gestures that come through, and to me, this is it's of course obviously it's planned, but it's one of those things that's so inherently dramatic that the way that it affects the sound, I think, is something that always impresses me as a listener. The fugue in A minor is a big one, so I'll just show you one thing from it. The fugue itself, I'll play the opening for you, and then I want you to hear how he sets it dramatically in the way that I've spoken about before in the context of preludes, where I've shown you a few examples where you'll hear a chord, and then suddenly there will be something, a cadenza or something like that happens. Well, in this case, you have something that I would call something like a Fugal cadenza or something like that, where you have the subject you have this moment where the chords happen, and then you have this subject that kind of comes in this context that is different for it, and therefore kind of free and cadenza-like, at least to my ear. So here's what the fugue sounds like at the beginning. So you get a sense of, it's a pretty straightforward fugue in this case, and then we'll hear what happens later. It's a long fugue. It's one of the longest ones in the Walter Clavier. but we're getting close to the right spot here, I think. So you can hear how like you get the subject is embedded there, and if you're really following it along, you'll probably hear it. But the context is such that the musical phrase is larger than that subject structure that's there, and so that's why it kind of collapses on itself into the chords that you hear towards the end. So it's a very dramatic and clever gambit. The last piece I'll show you just a little bit of is the fugue in B flat minor. This one is a very astounding one to me. It's got this leap of a minor ninth that appears at the beginning. That's just like an octave, but 1/2 step a little bit higher. And that's a dangerous thing in a fugue, to have something that's that large of a leap, because it means that you could easily go awry if you're not careful. But it also gives Bach this incredible opportunity that he takes great advantage of. And I've done a little bit of analysis of it towards the end in the second example that you'll see there. So first I'll play the fugue theme itself. Let me just get to the right spot. So you get a sense of what's happening there. And then here what happens to it towards the end. And what I really want you to pay attention to, I don't know if you can see my mouse right now, but maybe not. Yeah, you can, okay. I'm circling this particular minor ninth that I think the whole piece, he just wanted to do this, and this is why he has this in there as a subject thing. That's complete speculation and not true of what he was actually thinking, I'm sure. But it's something that I like to think he might have thought, if that makes any sense. So let me play that spot and just hear how dramatically this works out, because basically he starts to move the minor ninth and also major ninths going in two different directions at once. And the effect is quite dramatic towards the end of the piece, and so we'll just listen to the end here. So he has these wonderful stacked fifths, which yield ninths when you stack them. And it also has that wonderful E natural that comes into play there. And it feels wrong, but it feels so right. It's really a nice thing to do in that case. So thank you all for listening. This is just some thoughts about this piece, which is an amazing set. And I think it's a great privilege to be able to hear this wonderful artist tonight, and I'm looking forward to it. I hope